Okay. Good afternoon. As Christopher just told you, we decided to do it in English this second half of the discussion so that it can flow a little bit faster as well.
It's always easier for the
I'm sure everyone is willing to participate in the debate, so I'll try not to take too long. I'll also speak a little bit slower. Sorry about that. I would like to start thanking the comrades from Translib for the invitation, for hosting us here, and everyone who showed up to participate in the debate. It's obviously very interesting, and we're both commenting how happy but how surprised we are that so many people found it interesting to come and discuss this subject. Usually in Portugal, we're used to the idea that the only people who are interested in Portugal are Portuguese. In this case, I think obviously people are more interested in the revolution than in Portugal by itself, which is also my case. Let me move quickly to the main subject. Although I'm, as Christopher told you, I'm a historian, but I speak about the revolution in the double condition of a wage laborer. So for me, being a historian was just a chance of getting a fellowship and not having to work in a call center or a shopping center or something like that. And as a communist, I don't like the word militant that much, but as a communist, I'm very interested in the subjects of revolution, social conflict, and so forth. So jumping to the subject, I'll start by picking the questions that George brought up, and especially this thing about this lady that says what we need is a new 25th of April. That is a common sentence you hear in Portugal from working class people. It's not by chance, because if you look at the statistics, 74, 75, and 76 to a lower degree are the single years in the 20th century in which the income gained by labor by the working class was bigger than the income won by capital in the division of income in the Portuguese society. So the only 3 years in a full century. And that brings us back to a century-long pattern of capitalist accumulation, state repression, very strong inequality between social classes. That is the pattern that shapes Portuguese history and contemporary experience and modernity in Portugal in general. That was true in 73, and that is true now. So basically, if you study the wages and you compare it with the cost of living, it is true that the real wage right now in Portugal is actually a little bit below the one in 73. And so there's a conjuncture here that is what puzzles us. What happened and why did it happen in such a way? Not going very far into structural aspects, because I think the revolutionary moment is what actually interests us. There is this element of the war. As Jorge told you, Portugal was by then the second most militarized society in the world. So after Israel and before the United States and before South Africa, even if you only consider the white population in South Africa, the rate of mobilization, I mean the proportion of mobilized men in an adult age was the biggest one, so the second biggest in the world after the state of Israel. And it's not by chance that the armed forces overthrew the regime. It has to do with this fact that it became the polarizing and all the contradictions of Portuguese social formation became concentrated within the armed forces. An ongoing war in which, and it's not by chance either that the captains and these middle rank officers were the people leading the process, because they were the ones who commanded the companies in the battlefield, and basically the Portuguese army had divided the African territories which it had to police. There was not a very colonial war in official terms. It was a policing action against terrorism. And that was, until the end of the war, it was always considered a terrorist threat. And so the captains commanded a company that had this square of the territory, and They had to take care of not only the military aspects, but also the social and psychological contact with the population. So the Portuguese army became politicized and radicalized itself very quickly. One, because of this structural experience of working class people, poor people coming to the army and experiencing the violence of that war. And two, being exposed to the contact with the population that's even more exploited than their experience back home. So the African population was almost reduced to slavery in more than one sense, in the sense that the war, I don't want to go very deep into it, but the way the war was fought, inspired in the American experience in Vietnam, also included concentrating the population in fortified villages to take them away from the guerrillas. So the impact over their way of living, their, the pattern of social life was totally changed during the colonial war, and the Portuguese army had to impose that kind of oppression. And so it politicized itself not only because it was defeated, which is quite clear, especially in Guinea-Bissau, a little bit less in Angola, partially in Mozambique, so depending on the actual regions, but especially it was totally defeated on the psychological terms and political terms. It was an army fully contaminated by the propaganda of its enemy, the guerrillas, who were always saying, we're not fighting the Portuguese people, we're fighting colonialism and fascism. And so, and that had an impact over the soldiers, because the radio transmissions of the guerrillas, a lot of times with Portuguese deserters, had a brutal and major impact over the morale of the soldiers. But also the propaganda back home, where the students' movement had radicalized very quickly, had strong influence of the far left, and there was this massive feeling, accumulated feeling, that the war was unfair and could not be won. And so the combination of this made the moment for these young officers, middle-ranking officers, to basically subtract the military from their traditional hierarchy and overthrow the regime. There's also another element which I think must be taken into account, which is the very fast economical growth and industrial growth and modernization of Portuguese society, which included thousands of people leaving their countryside villages, 1 million of which went to Northern Europe, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and would write home telling people back home how we live here, where there's political freedom, trade unions, the far left gaining ground, May 68, wages going up, permanently going up, consumption levels that people were unheard of for people in Portugal, chances for a worker's son to become a doctor, an engineer, to socially ascend, to cut it short. And so this perception that where there was democracy, freedom, there was also class struggle, and the whole of that produced something that was much better for working class people than the reality people lived in Portugal. And at the same time, if 1 million people went out of Portugal to other parts of Europe, especially Central and Northern Europe, it's hard to fully calculate, but probably over 1 million people moved from the countryside to the cities, especially Lisbon's industrial belt. And this was a very quick change, something like that happens in less than a generation, 15 years, and in which people who were basically subdued to a very patriarchal, paternalist, conservative, very religious, very unequal pattern of social life, all of a sudden were confronted with city life, political agitation, albeit there was very strong repression, but some political activity, very high cost of living. The inflation in Portugal from 65 onwards was always rising, and it reached 20% a year in 73. So that means that, every month things go 20% up. And at the same time, very strong repression over the political left, but especially over working class militancy. So the political police had a special concern about policing the factories, the enterprises, and they were paid for by the big monopolist groups, by the big families who owned the country. And so the perception of inequality, repression, this war that cannot be won, this life that people in other parts of the world don't live like this anymore, the perception that something is so wrong in here created this radicalization process. There were several cycles of protest and social conflict in Portugal. let's say 3 or 4 during the dictatorship, but the final one from 68 onwards, and obviously the year 68 here is not by chance, proved itself to be too much for the regime to handle. And so working class militancy, students' radicalization, the perception of young people that I'm going to fight a war that I don't want to fight, that I don't think it's fair, and that cannot be won. So the whole combination of this produced a radicalization of this Portuguese society. And usually when historians speak about what happened after the 25th of April, they use the metaphor of a pressure pan that was, blocked, and all of a sudden the lead came off, and the pressure just had to go somewhere. And so what you have after the 25th of April is a very strong, very fast, very accelerated, and very deep crisis of state power. I think George pointed in that direction. All of a sudden, the political police that seemed omnipotent, that had 10,000 informants, which meant that wherever you were talking politics, there could be one informer of the political police, which meant that he would write your name in the paper, which meant that you would be possibly arrested and severely tortured. So the repression in Portugal is known for being not very deadly in comparative terms, especially when you compare it to Spain, which is the most obvious comparison, but extremely, extremely effective in terms of the management of fear in the common population. So torture, denunciating, making you disappear and your family doesn't know where you are, and that kind of thing was highly effective during the 48 years of dictatorship. And all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, so the first plan of the military was actually to leave the political police, the PID, intact, because they were also working with the military in the colonies, and they were helping the war effort in the colonies. And although the coup was done to put an end to the war, there was this perception that maybe there would be the need to continue the war a little bit further. And so to subtract the political police would mean to subtract the informations, the intel of the militaries. So in the plan, they decided not to go for the political police. But, and in the day of the putsch, the military coup, they gave orders for the population to remain at home. And that's the first single moment in which the military coup is already side by side with the popular revolution, in which thousands of people going against the orders of the military uprising go on into the streets, surround the headquarters where the last prime minister sought refuge, and then afterwards, through their own initiative, decided to attack and storm the political police headquarters. And there were 6 people died in that process. Eventually, the political police surrendered to Marines, Fuzileiros, so basically the naval infantry, Marines. Yeah, but it's not the same as in America. So the naval infantry, which is traditionally a left-wing regiment in Portugal, very influenced by the Communist Party. So they came and they got the surrender of the political police. Most of them were arrested. After a lot of them were actually released. Most of them were released, and eventually they even got state pensions for their contribution to the state. So this is a long and ongoing story. Anyway, that first moment in which people storm the political police is the first sign that state crisis will appear, because only some weeks after the riot police, the Companhia Móvel, which had become really, really extremely unpopular in the last years of the regime, was also dissolved, was also finished. And so all of a sudden, the Portuguese state didn't have repressive forces, so that the state monopoly of violence all of a sudden suffers this crisis. And when the government decides something, it has no instrument to make it real. So if there's a demonstration and the government decides to make it illegal, what they have to send to enforce that decision is not a riot police, which is trained not to talk to you, not to listen to your demands, and just beat you up and eventually kill you if that is needed, but usually avoiding the deaths of people. So in this economy of legitimation of the state, what the Portuguese state had after the riot police was dissolved and the political police was dissolved was army units, where army units in Portugal in 1974 were normal people had been mobilized to go and fight in the war, and who were mostly interested in finishing the war. And so what you have in May and June 74 is immediately a huge campaign against new people being shipped to the new soldiers being shipped to the war. And obviously, the government says, don't let that demonstration go around. And the soldier thinks and says, okay, these guys are demonstrating so that I don't have to go to Africa. And that guy is telling me to send them home. Obviously, there's something here that will not work. And what happens is that the popular movement, this transgressive pattern of action and social conflict, gains momentum from this perception that there's no one here to repress us. The people they send to repress us will not. This has some nuances, and I would have to go into details, but it also applies to labor conflicts. And immediately after May 74, there's this big demonstration in the May 1st, which the new government and the generals who got in power after the coup didn't want to legalize, but they had to because they realized that if they didn't, they would be confronted with a huge demonstration that they had prohibited. And so 1 million people come out into the streets, and immediately labor conflicts start to emerge. As I said, 20% of inflation in the last years of the dictatorship, a very repressive regime against working class, and so people seize the opportunity, understand that they can do something about it, and namely in the big factories of the Lisbon industrial belt, so Lisnave, which was a very big shipyard, TAP, which was the air company, several metal work companies, and other enterprises, so big and small, but there's a massive surge of labor conflicts that all win, basically. And what the Portuguese working class gains there is basically what most of the Western European working class had gained in the previous 30 years. And what happens is that you have a very quick enhancement of the levels of reproduction of the labor force, to use this Marxist language, and at the same time a very backward Portuguese capitalism. And so you have this difference between the two things. And so economy immediately enters in a crisis. The crisis was already there, the world crisis of 73, but the fact that the wages had gone up so quickly made the crisis much bigger and severe. And so the question of power within the workplaces immediately posed itself, because the managers, the bosses, the owners immediately said, okay, but this company is not, we cannot run it with this level of wages. And that kind of triggers new conflicts, because, okay, if you can't manage the company, we'll manage the company, just step aside, please. And that kind of shapes the dynamic of social conflict, at least from May 74 until the winter spring of 75. What happens in the winter spring of 75? A massive surge of nationalizations, state intervention, a lot of bosses, especially the big families that ruled the country and whose names were very familiar for everyone, Espírito Santo, Melo, Champalimau, and some other families, most of them who were basically the directors of most of the big companies in Portugal, most of the banks, most of the insurance companies, they all flee the country, either to Spain, either to Brazil. It's a more complex story. I won't go into details once again, but it usually has to do with attempts of coup d'etat by right-wing military that are either clearly backed by these families and these big economic interests, or allegedly supported by them. But either way, the perception among workers was that it's either us or them, and they're interested in a return to fascism. So all these military coups that are always fail are always attempts to bring back time into fascism. And so after the spring of 75, and this is a decisive moment in the sense that that's when most companies start being nationalized, or under state intervention, which was a more ambiguous thing, which basically meant that the state recognized the power of the workers' committee, but at the same time imposed on it some conditions. So they had to do reports, they had to have a direction clearly identified, and so forth. But this moment in which there's this understanding that capitalism in Portugal cannot function as it has functioned until now. And so there's this reshaping of social relationships, and especially property relationships. And what comes up as the Portuguese path towards socialism is a series of ambiguous projects that all try to surf this wave, in which basically they want to accept the fact that the workers' power is incompatible with the with the current property forms, that something has to change on that, and at the same time that the state crisis, the fact that the government gives orders, people don't obey it, there's no way to enforce them. So at the same time, you change the property relationships, so you have elements of a new regime of accumulation, and you, at the same time, you absorb these demands in the state apparatus, and so you have a new mode of governmentality. And it's this overlapping of the two things that, in my opinion, helps us explain the process of the revolutionary process after the Spring of '75. Spring of '75 is also the moment where the first elections, free elections of a universal suffrage, so the women also vote. It's the first time in Portuguese history, are upheld, and there's a clear majority that votes for the moderate parties, the Socialist Party and the Popular Democratic Party, which is the right-wing party that's currently in government. So what you have after that is not only most of the most radical struggles have been, its outcome has been accepted by the state structure as it is, but you also have a new legitimacy for a government to govern. So you have clearly these parties, 92% of the electors went to vote, so it was a very representative election in more than one way. At the same time, you have the realm of ambiguity, because these parties, both the People's Democratic Party and the Socialist Party, had programs that were extremely radical. Nationalizations, socialism, self-management, workers' democracy, people's democracy, and whatnot. So these parties didn't win the elections with a conservative program or to let's go back to normal program. They were like fully committed with the revolution. We want socialism. The Socialist Party actually tried to play that it was at the left of the Communist Party. And so this is the complexity of reading these results. Anyway, after these elections and after the nationalizations, you have, so the revolution is kind of divided in two. In the first, you have workers' autonomy against state power, surfing this situation in which state authorities in crisis and the monopoly of violence by the state no longer rules, and the army has been contaminated by the revolution and so forth. And after the spring of '75, from then onwards, what you have is the reconstitution of state power. But not any state power, it's this state power, socialist, Portuguese path towards socialism, something that, there were like 5, 6, 7, 50 versions of it, but all comprise the idea that, we accept workers' power in the factories as long as there are elections, pluralism, and so forth. And so what you have at the same time is that the state reconstitutes itself in a new way, but imposes itself also on the workers' movement and on the people's movement. We didn't talk a lot about the neighborhoods committees, but there was this massive process of housing occupation by poor people, especially in Lisbon and Porto, so the big cities, which had industrialized. Thousands of people had come to work there, but they couldn't find a house. It was too expensive. So there were huge slum towns or very degraded neighborhoods. And so these people, after the 25th of April, started occupying a lot of, not only houses to live, but also buildings to build nurseries or small hospitals or, just social centers, that kind of thing. And also both the workers' committees and the neighborhood committees, or the tenants' committees, were both recognized by state power in the spring of '75. There are laws, the most revolutionary laws ever done, and so forth. And so what the state does is that it absorbs this movement, but at the same time it imposes itself on it, in the sense that it imposes conditions for it to be recognized. Where that is, you have to have clearly elected people who are, separated from the mass of the workers or of the neighborhood. And so what you have is the process of self-organization gives way to a process of hetero-organization. That is, that the state starts organizing the workers' movement. And I think that's the crucial moment of the revolution. So when you have the summer of '75, which is usually seen as the hot summer, countries in the brink of civil war, what you have is already a dynamic in which these two projects of state capitalism or democratic capitalism, but in the shape of a big state sector of the economy, a lot of rights to the working class and all that. These are the two main projects that are in dispute in the summer of '75. But for these two projects to take the main scene, to occupy the stage of the revolutionary process, it was needed before the autonomy movement of workers and poor neighborhood self-organization process to slowly give in to this state recomposition. And so what you have in the summer of 75 is already the dispute over a state. And what you had before that was something that was a state crisis in which the workers had the initiative, poor people had the initiative. And so for me, the center of gravity in each moment, and the Portuguese Revolution has different small conjunctures and small moments and cycles within it, although it only lasted 18 months, you can clearly devise from May 74 to September 74, then from September 74 to March, April 74, from then to the beginning of the fall, and from then to the end of November of 75. So these 4 different stages. But in each moment, for me, the center of gravity that we need to understand is who has the initiative, who is on the offensive, who is conditioning the action of its opponents. And I think quite clearly that from the spring of 75 onwards, slowly, first the technocracy and bureaucracy started gaining its momentum, and then afterwards, clearly, the representatives of the bourgeoisie, the Portuguese bourgeoisie, gained the momentum. This is the bourgeoisie that is not in the country. It's in exile, in exodus. No politician will say, we want them to come back. None. No one would say that at the time. But obviously what was about was creating the conditions for a normalization and a stabilization that would allow these old owners of the Portuguese economy, this old economic elite, to come back and gain its lands or its companies back. There's a Portuguese sociologist very famous, especially abroad, especially in South America, actually, which is Boaventura Sousa Santos, who wrote a very good essay in the 80s. I think he wrote much more interesting things in the 80s than afterwards, about the revolution, Boaventura Sousa Santos. And he talked about a duality of impotences. So instead of a duality of powers, what you have, in a way, it's kind of playing with words, because any duality of powers is also a duality of impotence, in the sense that you can only do as much as the other will allow you. But what he talks is, his idea and his image, I think it's precious, which is this idea. There was no way for a fully Chilean-like counter-revolution in which the militant organized working class is just wiped out and its political parties of the left are just illegalized and you have a dictatorship. That was impossible in Portugal in 75. And at the same time, as Phil Mailer in the Portugal Impossible Revolution stated it, it was impossible for these small islands of libertarian communist or autonomist, self-organized factories and whatnot to survive in an ocean of capitalist relations. So what you had was this compromise, which is the outcome of the revolution, a compromise in which the Communist Party promises to discipline the working class movement, to control it and make it manageable, and the parties that control the state apparatus after September 75, namely the socialists, which are the key elements here, accept that, and at the same time compromise that there will be no open, widespread repression on the militant sectors of the working class. So what you have is this: we will normalize the working class, and through that we can reassure you that bringing the country back to its normal situation will not be a violent affair. And so hence this image of the velvet counter-revolution. So relatively few dead, a kind of phantasmagorical coup in November 25, which is very hard to precisely identify, and this putschist tendency, which Charles Reeve once wrote about very interestingly, which is this idea by the far left, which were basically the people who opposed this normalization, the idea that all we need to do is have the correct army units in our side and we'll do a far left coup d'etat, which was obviously something that militarily was very hard to triumph, and socially what would have come out of that would have been something very, very, very hard to imagine, but at the same time probably not something very good. Just to finish, for me, I was born in 79, so for me this is all something that happened before I came. But this experience lives on. And when you talk with working class people, militants, but not only militants, their faces shine, and the way they speak about it, it's usually very emotional, and usually goes about the best years that I ever experienced, which is similar to the whole generation of European and North American militants of the left, the 60s and 70s, but this is something else that I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who were beaten and oppressed for a long, long time, and in 18 months they could imagine a totally, radically different life, not just, freedom of speech and of association, which in itself is quite important, let's say it out loud, but a totally, radically different life, organized according to totally different values, in an horizontal level, and so forth. Just to give you an example, in 2005, along with some other comrades, we squatted in the center of Lisbon in this neighborhood called São José, which is not known for being, the harbor of militant radical people. We occupied and we tried to establish a relationship with the neighborhood. It wasn't always easy. It's a poor neighborhood and whatnot. But I remember quite clearly, as if it was today, this young guy, like 25, something like that, had just been a father, very proletarian. You could see that he didn't go to demonstrations or whatnot. He was partially aware of what things were happening, but he wasn't this very committed person. But when he looked at us and looked at the building occupied, he said, "This is great. It's just like in the 25th of April, right?" And so this memory of someone who didn't live the process, who's not a militant, probably his family is not a militant, but somehow the memory of the process lived out and was passed to another generation of the revolutionary process as a moment where impossible things could happen, and where we had the upper hand and we had the initiative, and they, so the bad guys, these bad people that run the country and society, were all afraid of what it was that we could do. And so in moments like this, in which we're living, everybody's probably aware that Portugal was under intervention and the real wage went really down, million unemployed, and police repression just went sky high and so forth. But although the 25th of April and its official celebrations stand as the celebration of the consensual democracy and whatnot, still in the last 25th of April, thousands and thousands of people took to the streets. And it wasn't by chance, because there's still a big divide and a gap in that society. And there's still a us and them. And 25th of April is still the moment that, and by 25th of April I speak about the revolution itself and not the day, is still the moment that clearly divides that society in half, one of which wants it to keep on functioning as it does right now, and the other wants precisely the opposite. And thank you. Come here, just translate. Maybe she comes if somebody wants to speak in German. She can translate for us.
Space for all the questions that accumulated during the presentations. First, all the questions, special question, and then the discussion. First, him. Okay.
Well, I said something before. Okay.
Do you want me to answer? I forgot to answer your question. I don't know if George fully answered your question about. Yeah? Okay.
Okay, so the other question will be, in what way did people start during this whole process to supersede, to transgress commodity production? Meaning that in what way did they reorganize their social life, the reproduction, beyond forms of money, commodity based social life?
Do you want to start? Should I start? Okay.
Yeah.
So it varied from place to place. In more than one place, this moment in which the state intervened or nationalized and recognized the situation, it imposed its own rules. But in some situations, that was not the case. Obviously, we can discuss what it means to supersede the commodity form. But the fact that people detach productivity from income and exchange things without the mediation of money and the law of value, so that we know exactly how much this is worth, and so you have to pay for it. In a lot of places that happened in the sense, or it was planned to happen, since that people got together and decided how should we make this work. The fact that the process was so fast in some cases blocked that, and then eventually the police came back and actually took the factories out. But I was able to, in archives and so forth, find some documents. And there was such things like the metal workers went on strike and announced to the government that they would directly negotiate with the occupied land committees. So there was this massive units of production that were created in the south, which were occupied by the workers, and then the state recognized it and made a legal dispatch. And they were like, okay, so you're blocking the credit to them, so we'll just go directly to them and exchange. We'll give them our products, the metal, so that they can plow the fields and whatnot. And we'll discuss with them the ways that they will, pay us back. We can almost discuss, so if there's a payback, it's commodity. But there's this process of trying to get around it. And you have other moments like this in which construction firms that are intervened. There was in Sacavém, a little bit north of Lisbon, which ended in early 76 with armed cars going in and taking the construction workers out of the company. But they did a huge project along with tenants and neighbors committees. So we'll help you build new houses or reinstore the houses, and we'll see how we'll. But at the same time, and I think your question goes to the heart of the problem, obviously the bank system always played a very decisive role. The bank workers' union, which was totally controlled by the Communist Party until the end of August of 75, had a major role in this. And what they did was serve as middlemen between the state and any workers' committee in a self-managed company. And then they would go to the labor ministry and negotiate. A credential would be given, and they could basically use the money of the company in the bank or open a new account and get credit from the state. So there was this negotiation process. And once the channel of negotiation is open, for most workers, it's a very pragmatic decision to get the wages, ensure that I have the money to pay my rent, put food on the table, and so forth. And it's this process that it makes it so problematic to fully understand how far did the process go. But what I did find was a will to go beyond the commodity relation. How far did people actually go is another discussion, which we can have, obviously. But it's the time here is the key element, because there's a moment in which people have things and they have the upper hand, and there's the moment there in which they've just lost it. And I don't know.
Yeah, I agree essentially with what has been said by Ricardo. I think it was a process. But it was in terms of abolishing the wage system or abolishing the value relation. That we didn't got there. It was that takes more than 1 year. I think that what's important here is to see this aspect that Ricardo just underlined. The will of people. People was looking for society organized in a different way. They didn't want to go back to the old way. The project that was offered to them as a solution was the state socialism, basically, and that they also realized very fast it was an authoritarian project. And that's an element very strong in this 1 year of the Portuguese social agitation or revolution, whatever we want to, the way we want to call it, is the fact that the Communist Party played an enormous role in that in this movement was never able completely to go behind these defiance that people had towards their authoritarian way. And that I think, I've been thinking quite a lot about that. I think there are reasons in the Portuguese history and culture who explains that in a way, because Portugal is a country where the authoritarian system has been strong from the beginning of when it was built in the 12th century, because it was built by the military orders. And but there is also a country where there is a very strong libertarian feeling for people in the minds of people, sometimes in a very passive way. But it's not a society who is really very attracted to authoritarian tendencies and authoritarian projects. Actually, even Salazar used to say that Nazism and fascism were too strong for the Portuguese culture, because he felt himself that didn't fit in the Portuguese way of functioning. I'm not doing any nationalistic speech about the Portuguese culture, but I mean the fact is that this protection against the Communist Party appeared very, very early in the Portuguese Revolution. I mean, although the Portuguese militants were very present, they had paid a big tribute during the fascist period, and they were very active. But right away after the revolution, when they start to intervene in a party way, in an authoritarian way, they provoked a reaction. And actually, Ricardo also told that very fast minutes ago, the Socialist Party and the right used that in a way, because people really there was a point, this summer of 75, that also brings us to that question, the moment when things turned. I mean, this summer was also a period where the communists start to be attacked, not always in a good way, and not always in the good for the good reasons, but start to be attacked directly by people, because they were in some situations they were seen as new authoritarian people coming in. Well, I'm going out of your question, but what I want to say in a way is that, well, I think Ricardo already said that what was important here was that there was a desire of building something new. People didn't have enough time to do it, first of all because of the question of time, but also for the question of space. Portugal is a very poor society, very isolated. It was necessary at least to have some connection with Spain. That didn't happen. And the rest of Europe was just looking, I mean, or going there doing revolutionary tourism. I mean, a lot of people went there and helped a lot and get engaged in struggles and strikes and so forth. But that was not the same thing that creating the conditions to spread the movement elsewhere. So there was not really time to raise these questions of creating a society where products were produced and dominated and distributed in a different way without going through the market. I mean, the market has been always there. It's too long, but I mean, that's...
Well, everyone in Europe except for Guy Debord, who refused to go when he was invited by Afonso Monteiro.
Well, he had something to do.
Yeah.
Well, just, do you really think that there's one revolution that was in the benefits of the people? Because what you can realize after the return of the democracy in every country that they have a dictator, you can realize after 20 years that they really didn't get the benefit that they wanted in the beginning, and you can realize that the people who have the power, in one moment they put the dictator, and they say, okay, we are owner of the country now because they changed the constitution.
understand better that it's not good to be rich in one country that is one dictator. So they stop to support the dictator and they open the door that this kind of democracy, that the people have more guarantee to use the money, to go to the bank, and that is good for us, the rich people. So if you really think that there's one revolution that was in the benefit of the people in one country or one example or something like that, because it's hard to find, you know.
You mean in the history of humanity? The whole history?
Well, on the 70s, you know, that happened a lot in Chile or in Nicaragua or in, I don't know, in Ecuador.
Well, I don't... Can I?
Of course. My guest.
I don't see things like that. I understand what you mean. But I don't think it's very useful for our minds, if we are against this society, to think in those terms, because that's what happens after. But when things are happening, I mean, you don't know. I mean, it's open. So
you think that could happen now?
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what will happen tomorrow. I mean, societies are very difficult to analyze in terms of moment, because you can be living in a society where nothing happens, and tomorrow you have a general strike and people are looking for another way of life and things like that. So it's the fact that never happened doesn't mean for me that will not happen.
Okay. No, but
So
the question is, so you also think that never happened?
Revolution. That's what.
Yeah.
it always happened, but it ends up that way. It's true. Till now we have all the people who want to change the world have been defeated.
Yes.
But we are still here.
Yeah.
And other people will come.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this society is not, I mean, it's sick. I mean, we cannot live on this stuff. So we live, but we don't live well.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who think that they don't do anything, but they also agree with us. But I mean, that's it's true. So far we have been defeated. But that's not a reason to start again tomorrow.
Yeah.
I mean, I think.
Actually, well, if I can add something to what George just said. So I think people live better in Portugal now than they did before the 25th of April. I strongly believe that. In terms, well, like, for instance, there's usually when moderate left-wing people, so going as far as left bloc, which is the equivalent to Die Linke here, and to the Socialist Party, if we can still call them left-wing, I don't know. So this institutional left, let's call it like this. Whenever somebody asks like that, or actually says, which there's still a lot of people who will say that in Portugal, oh well, but we were better off before 25th of April because, you know, the coin was strong. We had our own coin, which right now, as you can imagine, is a very strong imaginary thing. But, you know, the coin was we'd go shopping and with one escudo we would bring back so many things. That's a very common phrase. But whenever that is said, people will just, you know, open the book of statistics. So it's like Portugal is one of the countries where more children would die. And I'm not saying dying at labor, which would also happen, but dying in the first year of their lives because they didn't have enough to eat. Actually, when you look at pictures of Portugal, films, you see that people don't have enough to eat. On the 25th of April, the faces of people, I mean, they don't look like we do, which we do 3 meals a day. You know, we can have at least all the nutrients that we need, maybe not enough vitamins, I don't know, and the food probably is not, you know, it has too many pesticides, whatnot. But, you know, you have the calories, the minimum calories to, and that was not the case for the majority of the Portuguese population at all before the 25th of April, and it became the case. You know, enough to eat, enough, your children, the evolution in child mortality is just, it's one of the countries where less children die right now. Which, for me, for instance, I'm going to be a father in some months. I think that's quite important. But there's a lot of other, you know, indicators like alphabetization, people who know how to read and whatnot. It's still a very backward, poor country, unequal. But was it worth it? Yeah, I think it was worth it in more than one way. And at the same time, I would just rephrasing your question, or I don't know, changing it a little bit. I think there are cycles. So people mobilize, struggle, win things. They're on the break of winning, then they lose. There's a capitalist restructuring. Things change. The shape of things change. You have to learn how to struggle in this new scenario. And I think we're still learning how to struggle in post-Fordism, neoliberal, restructured capitalism. We're living the first serious crisis of that flexible accumulation regime, which was created in the end of the 70s, early 80s, and then spread throughout the world. We're still learning how to do it. And so it's very likely that we'll be more defeated than we win for a long time. I mean, it's not by chance that they're the ruling class. They have a lot of instruments, a lot of strength, a lot of resources. They're not stupid, unlike what we sometimes like to think. And so they'll be around, and we'll be around, and we'll see. But so they're cycles. It's not as simple as revolutions that always are defeated and we end worse.
For example, in what happened in Chile, they, when Salvador Allende wants to keep the power, USA say no, we need a dictator. And when they don't need more the dictator, they say, okay, we can support more the dictator, we need the democracy, you know? And that is what I mean. That revolution was not really for the people. Because they are owner now of all the country, USA and the big companies and some families in Chile, you know? So that revolution was not really for the people. Of course, the people is better than before. Of course, the people is better because the revolution, you know? But I don't know, it was, it's complicated.
But you mean the 3 years with Allende Unidad Popular government? I don't think that was a revolution. It was an electoral win by a left-wing coalition. Oh, okay. So yeah, but it's not a revolution. There was a referendum in Chile, right? I don't want to downplay the social struggle in Chile.
It was a referendum, but you know, the people died in the street anyway.
I'm quite sure that a lot of people struggled quite a lot in Chile, and it's not that. It's just that.
But that is what I mean. But they did really, they really opened the door to democracy because they want to. They have what they need, and they don't need more detail. But that was my.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But I understand what you think.
Yeah, sure. But I agree with you. Still.
My question is for Ricardo. You told us about the families who owned the country before the 25th of April. Perhaps you can explain more about their strategy after the 25th of April to regain power, to have the control again about their factories and the economy in general.
Usually the classical explanation is that there were 7 big economic groups, which were called the Magnificent Seven, who owned the country in the sense that they owned most of the big strategic companies, so the production of steel, paper, electricity, tobacco, the banks, most of the metalworks, a lot of multinationals were joint ventures, whatnot. And I think all of them had to flee the country, especially after March 11, when there was an attempted coup. They were defeated, and their companies were nationalized, and they started being arrested. First of all, they were liberated, so they were taken out of prison because the international bourgeoisie and establishment intervened. So the World Bank, for instance, they were negotiating a loan, and they said, okay, in order for the negotiation to continue, you have to take the Espírito Santo family out of jail. That's the first thing. And they were backed by big business. Especially the Espírito Santo family were very connected with the Rothschilds and a lot of Rockefeller, a lot of big people. And they went abroad, to Brazil especially, to the international circuit, Luxembourg, which was an offshore already, Swiss, London, Madrid. And throughout all that, they had put a lot of money out of the country, a lot of money. Not as much as they lost, obviously, but thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So they used that money. They had credit lines from big banks internationally, and they rebuilt their fortunes, especially in South America, Brazil, Paraguay, where there were dictatorships, basically, who were eager to attract foreign capitalists and all that. And then using that money, they started buying companies in Portugal from the late 70s and early 80s. so before the privatization process actually began. And then when it began, and it was mostly after 89, the constitution was changed, because originally the constitution, which was approved in 76, said that the nationalizations were irreversible. You could not give that back to their owners. In 89 it was changed, allegedly because the European Communion imposed it, but that's not even true. But it was in this pro-market, Maastricht, European Union integration process that it was explained that no, but the European Union is about market economy. We have distortions of the market because the state owns this and that. And so after 89, these old families who were owners of the country came back, got money back in indemnization, you say that? Indemnization from the state, and with that money bought back their companies. And in some cases, it was an open offer, a public offer. Whoever bid bigger would get the companies. But in some cases, the government actually refused offers by Spanish banks or German banks or French banks and sold them back to these countries, to these companies, to keep the strategical decision in Portugal. And what most of these families' interests did was, in the late 90s, sell them away, very highly valued. In the meantime, because the Portuguese economy grew a lot in the 90s, in relative terms, obviously. And so they sold these companies that they bought with money that the state had given them, very cheap, preferentially in a lot of times, but without any kind of condition. And then they sold it back to the biggest offer, made huge amounts of money, and then invested in non-concurrential sectors. So land estate, real estate, health systems, private health, a lot of services that are not competitive. Electricity company, which has a monopoly but is private, which is now bought by the state, Chinese state electricity company. So these families rebuilt their fortunes abroad, enhanced them by buying off their former companies, and then multiplied it by 10 by selling it back to international lenders, and that's how and they're still in power. The Espírito Santo administrator was actually in the ministry council where the Troika agreement was finally settled. So this is how strong these people are. I mean, and obviously not even in Portugal that is supposed to happen. Not even in a banana republic like Portugal, you're supposed to have a big banker sitting with the ministers deciding an agreement that will last 3 years and will basically restrain the sovereignty of the country. But that's the country where that kind of thing happens, and it's all normal. They own a lot of newspapers, they condition the television through the publicity, and so that country is in the pocket of, again, the guys who owned the country before, some newcomers, and some international interests, obviously.
Right now of the social movements in Portugal, and I read a text. It was on that page, .com or something. I don't know, editions Antipaticas, something like that. And they had a rather optimistic diagnosis. I think it was like they described the process of the social movements of the last 3 years as a process of like gaining experience and becoming stronger and more radical, and I would be interested in how you see the situation right now, and
you live there.
The atmosphere.
I'm a member of the collective who wrote that.
You are part of the problem.
Yeah, I'm part of the problem. I'm definitely not part of the solution. So the text was originally written in Portuguese and for a Portuguese audience, and so in public, in the sense that it was this self-reflection of the movement. We never pose ourselves as this vanguard group that comes and says, everyone, this is what you should do. It was more, what we tried to do was contributing to a process of discussion of what had happened in the last years that will help us. So, and expecting other people to come forward and say you're totally wrong, or we agree with you on that, not on that. So discussion, and then it went. I mean, it was almost finished in November 2012. Then a big riot occurred, so we had to write about it. And then there was a demonstration called, so we said, okay, let's just wait for this demonstration. And so eventually it was finished in March 2013. Although in Libcom it says the last 3 years, it's actually, so it only came out this year, so with the year gap. And in that year, a lot of things didn't happen. And so that's relevant to understanding the situation there. How the text ends is, there was a big demonstration in March the 2nd, 2013, so a year and a half, or a year and some months ago, where there was like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So I was in the end, but when I looked back, I couldn't see the end of the demonstration. And when I got to the square where it was supposed to happen, it had already finished, in the sense that there were no lights, and the stage had been shut down, and people had just scattered. I think what happened mostly in Portugal is that after a long time, so when the first anti-austerity movement started coming up, all the left organizations started disputing it and trying to beat the direction of it. And after some months and a lot of events which are described in that text, they just couldn't do it. And after a while, they were not allowed to do it at all. So there was no stage in the end of the demonstration, in the sense that when a demonstration arrived at somewhere, there would start clashes immediately. Well, not immediately, but after half an hour. But there was no space for a direction or, a spokesperson, somebody to come and say, okay, this demonstration was about this, we're here to show them this and that, which is the classical demonstration. For a while there was no conditions for that kind of direction of the movement to come up. And during the fall of 2012, that was the main dispute, whether or not we would allow that direction to come forward. And after November 14th was a general strike. It ended with a lot of things burning, a lot of clashes with the police, a lot of people arrested. I think the most radical and militant, people within the movement just got scared. And we lost the initiative then. I really can't go very far because I decided to go to Barcelona to the general strike that happened on that day, so I wasn't there. So then afterwards I wasn't there to say, okay, let's just take the initiative again. People were really scared of what was going to happen. In the newspapers, it was constantly announced that the police was about to crash in people's houses, to arrest the people responsible for that. And I think we lost the initiative there, sadly. And that demonstration in March the 2nd had thousands and thousands of people, but in the end there was a stage and a speech and people who actually said, okay, this is over now, you can go home. And so this apparatus, dispositive, I don't know how you say in English, or the Foucault thing, dispositive, so dispositive device, But this device in which there's people who call the demonstration, who tell in advance what the demonstration is about, will go to the press, say what it's about, and during the demonstration guarantee that it goes on smoothly, which is legally, and then in the end make a speech and tell you what it's about and then tell you it's over. That device was blocked for a year and a half or 2 years, I don't know, and then it came back and we allow it to be restored. And after that, we lost the initiative. After that, a lot of things happened still. There was a general strike in June of last year, in which we did some very interesting actions and pickets, with a lot less attention, a lot less media coverage, obviously. That ended with like 450 people marching to block the bridge over the river. They were kind of surrounded, arrested, whatnot, which made the trade unions to call for a march over the bridge, which the government illegalized. And at that moment there was another crucial moment, because we wanted it to happen in order to make it even more radical and go on and block the port of Lisbon, the harbor. And at the last minute the trade unions backed out, so the Communist Party again, they're always in this story basically because they controlled the unions in Portugal. And what happened was with the trade unions controlled by the Communist Party backed out. The trade union of the dock workers were a very radicalized sector during the last years, also backed out from the port blockade. And what ended up was like some hundreds of people marching into the port and facing a huge police block and back, basically. And I think mostly that we let the left-wing parties, which were never in government in the last years, so they're considered to be anti-power and anti-system because they're not in the government. But what they do basically is that the government controls us everywhere, and they control us when we're trying to fight the government control. So they control the streets. And for some years they lost that control because the streets were, flooded by thousands of people who just made their own rules. And after the first real clashes with the police, that wave started retreating, and then in this process of a year long, they gained the momentum and they gained the initiative. It's not over yet. I think the best is yet to come. But it is true that we're losing. So because basically what you have now is the device, the dispositif that was created after 25th November. We're still living that. So when I wrote that text, Never Winter Has Been So Long, is basically we're still living that time in which the street is no longer this unrestful, uncontrollable social force, but is actually part of a bigger strategy by the left-wing parties to uphold, to enhance and enlarge their influence in the institutions. And what you have now is the Communist Party and the left bloc, to a lesser degree, trying to channel the discontent of the streets to the elections. And up until now, they've been quite successful. The Communist Party just had 12.5% in the last elections, the European election, which is a very good result from their point of view. Yeah, well, go with all that. Yeah, it is. So more than half the people didn't vote. So this libertarian spirit of which George was speaking of, I think it's still important. The problem is that between its passivity and its activity, there are huge gaps here, right? Time gaps. So our challenge here is to make the passivity moment, be substituted for more very active moments. But there's no tradition in Portugal of big riots and confronting the police as there is in Germany, for instance, or in Spain, for that matter. So that kind of habit of confronting the police, it's not as strong there. What we wanted to point out in that text and that analysis was how it was kind of starting to emerge. So the goal was make Portugal Greece. So if they want to make Portugal Greece, we'll make Portugal Greece. This was the idea in the streets. But as you can see also in Greece, things are not as simple as leading a lot of things in fire. It's much more complex than that. So although I think we've been defeated, but it's not over yet.
You already said that the Communist Party was under attack. It was especially in the north of the country. And my
75.
75, yeah. And my question is, in my opinion, I'm not that expert that you both are. The question was, the country was divided. That in the north, the society was more Catholic, was more. You had small landowners, something like this. And my question is about, did the revolution never reach the north of the country or during the PREC? If the MFR failed to reach the people there, if they made any mistakes to win the people in the north for revolution, or perhaps it was impossible because they were too traditional. I don't know, my question is in this direction.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's all you said. It's true, but it's not enough to understand what happened. First of all, the north is there are north and north. I mean, it's there is a very industrialized, and there was a very strong industrialized part of the north of Portugal, all the zone on the coast and from Porto towards Galicia. And in that area, at that time, the exception for the big city of Porto, but the rest of these industrial zones, the CP was not very strong, the Communist Party. But that was for historical reasons, I think. What is interesting is that today, that's one of the strong basis of the Communist Party in this area, this north industrialized small factories, textiles, and places like that. They had improved their implantation in that zone. But I think it's more a connection with it's not so much the north and south. It's a connection with the form of landowners. I mean, in the south, in the south, not the real south, but just Alentejo, the part between Lisbon and the real south, the land ownership was latifundio, and so there was for years and years and centuries tradition of struggle there, and the people saw themselves not as peasants but as work peasants, or as working people working in the land, but not as landowners. And also there was the fact that in the north there was a stronger influence of the church, with a very strong political force in Portugal at that time. It was a party we didn't talk about, but a very strong party. And they had a role to control that zone in a very well done way, and they play a role against all the revolutionary measures or projects or so forth. And it's also true that the movement was basically strong in the urban areas and in these areas where there was the land workers. So the people in these backwards areas with small ownership, very, very poor, controlled by the church, it was difficult to reach them. And that was not so much, I don't think that didn't play a very strong role in the Portuguese Revolution. If there was a movement, if the movement itself has been developed in an autonomous, independent way, and the new forms of production and distribution have been developed, I think these areas will be connected more easily with the movement. But they were very isolated, and the only connection these areas had with outside was through immigration. That was another aspect that played a role in this movement, because the majority of the immigration, especially in France, Belgium, and Switzerland, but especially in France at that time, they came from those areas, and they were quite conservative, even if they were workers in France, and they saw the Portuguese Revolution in a very conservative way, and they were scared, because they were scared to lose the money they had put in this village, build their houses and all that, and they accept the propaganda of the church and of the right, saying that the revolution was going to take their beings and all that. But I mean, all these things are just facts. I personally, I don't think these areas played a very strong role in the revolution, and I think that they played the role when things went down. But when people were in movement, the social movement was having a development, these zones didn't play a very strong role. The army and the left, the traditional left in the army, Communist Party and some Maoist groups, they tried to do what they call dynamization of these areas. They send to this village a doctor or a nurse, try to improve the living conditions of people and make some help them to learn how to read and to write. I mean, it was very nice, but I mean, didn't really came from the people themselves, this thing. I mean, so it was like new doctors coming from the city, helping us, it's okay, it's nice, but in fact they were making a confrontation with the church and with the local cacique and all these people who had a role there. So, I don't know, I don't think it was a very important thing. I think that the immigration play a more strong role in the conservative turn, and also the people who came from the colonies, who were based mostly in the urban areas, and they also play a role in this turn against this sort of phobia, anti-communist phobia. But for me, at that moment, the movement was already in the downturn. I think the real turn in the movement was inside of the enterprises, inside of the occupied houses, and inside of the land occupied. And when inside of these places, people start to get disengaged, start to get tired, start to withdraw from the political fight between all the political groups. That's when the turn came for me. So the rest is just an accumulation of small factors that came through that. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
I agree with part of it. So I think there's two elements that I think are important here. Adding to what George said, the first is this demobilization of people in the factories and the enterprises regarding the control over their elected, representatives and whatnot. That there was a withdrawal, and that explains. I didn't mention it before. I just spoke about the state, how the state played very good cards in that, but also this kind of competition praxis by the far left groups also had a major impact, because basically every far left group had its workers' committees, its tenants' committees, its soldiers' organization. So it's very common to hear far left people in Portugal say, what we lacked in the revolution was a direction. And I think there were too many. There were like 15, all self-appointed, obviously, all balkanized, all I control this, you control that, and all that, and all always fighting amongst themselves and all fighting against the Communist Party. So this is the major trend. And after a while, people in the factory are like, okay, I've already gotten my wage enhancement. Fascism is probably not coming back, and I'm sick and tired of these guys. So I'm withdrawing to my private life and whatnot. So that was a major element, although it's very nuanced. Not everybody did that. Thousands of people didn't do that. So in the fall of 75, the movement was still very strong, and that's why a velvet counter-revolution was needed, because otherwise a civil war would have been a very risky card for the Portuguese ruling class to play. But also,
and the Spanish one too.
And the Spanish one. So, and I think this explanation of the national borders, this also answers some of the questions you've made. I think a revolution in Portugal would have been impossible. But Portugal, as the start of a European revolution, would have been very possible, especially in southern Europe. I don't want to... But, Spain Frank was about to die. The society was in a turmoil. Italy was the long May 68. France was France. And so... it's a scenarium. It's kind of virtual history, but if it had worked, it would not have been Portuguese socialism. It would have probably been the beginning of European revolution, with all that it implies. So a huge civil war, conflicts, the Cold War, and this is the complexity, because it's the years of May '68 and the Cold War, all overlapping and articulating and all that. But also about the church, there was one social conflict that actually had big implications with the church, which was the church radio, Radio Renascença. It was occupied by the workers, and they self-managed it for several months. So the bishops were all like, we want our radio back. We want our radio back. There were big demonstrations against the workers' committee. The Communist Party wasn't involved, but it was the far left, or the workers, but the far left was more backing it. But in the north, it was seen as the communists are taking over the church's radio, and that's how the church presented it. So people would go to mass, would hear the priest say the communists are taking over everything, including our radio, and people would leave mass and go and burn the Communist Party headquarters, or some far-left organizations where they were, or the trade unions. This was very strong in the north. The only places in the north where it didn't happen was Viana do Castelo, where there was a big shipyard, so big working class numbers, and in Vila Real, where there was a left-wing regiment of infantry, where it didn't allow it either. Otherwise, in the north, all the communist parties, big headquarters, big or not so big, all burned, people died, bombs were exploded, and so forth. And the Radio Renascença conflict was very polarizing. It ended up by the government ordering it to be restored to the church. The workers just occupied it and said, we won't come out. The military said, we won't take them out. And so what the government did was send the parachuting, parachutes, and said, okay, we have a secret mission for you. They didn't tell them what it was. They sent them and they put bombs on the transmitters. And that actually triggered the coup d'etat of 25th of November, because then the parachutes revolted against the government because they had been misled and so forth. But the Radio Renaissance conflict was a major element in terms of the church openly going against the regime, which was the Communist Party, upper hand in provisional governments. This is all very complicated when you go to details. And in these campaigns, some of them went better than the others, these dynamization campaigns.
Yes.
So the first ones were all about giving, toilets to people, doctors to people, bringing electricity, building roads. And that was kind of popular in the late 74. After that, the far left officers in the army said, no, that's not enough. Let's teach them politics. And that's when things really went sour. Because they had this habit of Africa, of the political, social campaigns, gaining the population to us. And that's what they tried to do in, rural peasant Portugal. And that was really unpopular. They were chased out of some villages several times.
They treat them like blacks. They didn't.
Yeah, that was also, there was a racist thing to it, right? They're treating us like they treated the Africans. So this is a very complex moment there. And I honestly, probably Jorge doesn't agree with me, but I think Portuguese peasants from northern Portugal, they're, revolution-proof. They're very conservative people. I worked with some of them in southern France picking fruit. And I don't want to generalize. Obviously, there's all kinds of people, but there's this structural conservatism that is just very strong in the sense that there were 50 of us sharing quarters. Each one had its broom, its pan, its forks, its knives. Each one had its own thing, and nobody shared. That was like communism, You want to share a broom? That's communism. And I really do think that until today there's two countries there. It's not only about North and South, but it's a little bit about North and South. And it's the property structure. So big property, wage labor, small property, each one has its own thing. Nobody wants to share. And this...
I think all the time there's kind of idea here, these Stalinists, this Communist Party and the European social democracy killed our wonderful, beautiful libertarian revolution. And not to argue in a psychoanalytical way, which might mean to say, we are lucky enough that they killed our revolution, because if we had really been forced to be responsible for the further course of this revolution and what we might have been faced with, luckily enough we haven't. So in a way, but this is not what I mean. We know since 1914 or 18 that the counter-revolution will
something the ultra-leftist Maoists or the Stalinists were able to coordinate on a national level and to send doctors and nurses to certain areas. Have there been any groups of the libertarians or how we might call them who really tried to think about how to organize on a national or on the territory of Portugal to organize the totality of production and reproduction on a social level as modern as possible? Have there been any attempts or groups that really tried to face that to overcome the Stalinist or Maoist or whatever groups or coordinations to go beyond them?
I can say something about that.
And not to keep the libertarian flag unspotted. Really
Well,
face with the path that were on the table at that point.
Well, I think I understand what you mean, and in a way I agree with you. I don't think the Portuguese Revolution, to talk about this special event, was defeated by the Stalinists. I think it was defeated by itself. I think it was defeated by the fact that it was not able to develop the capacity that has been created in the beginning to develop it to a level and to spread it to a point in which the political forces will be obliged to function in connection with that, but not directing it. Okay? So I think in a social movement, the political groups are part of a social movement, but I tend to underline what the people really does themselves more than what the groups do themselves. And that was what I think it was important in the Portuguese Revolution, and that goes back to the last question that Christopher had put in the presentation. What is modern still today in this revolution? I think there are two things modern. One is the fact that was a movement that was able, besides the fact that it was a society full of groups, political groups, directions and directions of directions, it was extremely politicized in that sense. But besides that, there was a movement that was able to produce and create organizations, relations amongst themselves, forms, experience of productions, trying to put things together. They didn't have enough time, and maybe they didn't have enough energy or strength to do it. And in this process, a lot of people from the political groups participate. Even a lot of communists from the Communist Party participate in autonomous struggles in Portugal at that time, even if after they were having problems with the direction of the party and so forth. But there was a moment, and that's true in every social movement, I think. There is a moment where, or a long moment, we hope it's longer it can be, where people, even part of political groups, can integrate and participate in something that it's bigger than themselves and bigger than their groups. And that's, I think, a modern aspect of the Portuguese Revolution. The second modern aspect, and that we go back to the political groups, is the fact that in any social movement nowadays, in modern societies, I think that the first counter-revolution aspect is any possibility that the movement is taken by a political group. That's the beginning of the end. And that's also very modern in the Portuguese Revolution. But I agree with you that it's not a question of, I didn't answer the question about the libertarians, but I'm going to answer. But it's not the question of the role of the Communist Party, who is to be criticized as being the bad guy. And they were present, they were very strong, but they ran after the movement for a long time. And that was an important moment. After it became other thing. concerning the libertarian groups is the same thing. I see them as I can see the Communist Party. It's the same thing. If it is a group who wants to impose his ideas on a movement, they play more or less the same role. In Portugal, they were very, very weak. There is, as maybe you may know, in the social history of Portugal, a very big importance of the anarcho-syndicalism and revolutionary unionism till the 20s, and it's from that tradition that the Communist Party actually was created, which is quite original in Europe. It's one of the cases, I think the only one in Europe that I know, where the Communist Party was created by anarchists directly. So that tradition is still very strong in the Portuguese society, but very, very offset. People don't know anything about that. Some people knows, but very little people. And at that time, these groups didn't exist at all. They have been destroyed by the fascism. They have been replaced by the Communist Party. It's a complicated story. We are not going to develop that here. But when the revolution started, when these autonomous movements started, there were libertarian tendencies who appeared inside of the movement who saw themselves as such without having the reference of the past. They didn't know that there was an anarchist movement. Many of them didn't know anything about that, but they assumed the fact they were apartidaire, they were anti-authoritarian, they were against a group or a party directing the revolution. So in a way, it was these tendencies who were the libertarian movement in Portugal, not groups. I don't know if you get what I want to say. It was not a formal libertarian movement, but the fact that inside of the movement itself there was a tendency who was pushing for things that we can call from the outside libertarians. And of course there are some groups who connect with that and played the role, especially a magazine called Combat, which has produced not a daily paper, but I think it was a monthly paper for a long period of time after it slowly became a more scared periodicity. But this magazine was created by people who came from the Maoism and others who came from immigration and others who came from anarchist tendencies, and their idea was to give a space in the magazine to the workers themselves. So they had an editorial once in a while, but most of the paper was full of interventions of people who were fighting in their factories or occupying their land or occupying houses or things like that. And this paper had quite an influence in that tendency that I call libertarian inside of the movement itself. And there were a small attempt to create an union, connect with the left tendency of the church, so not everything is bad in the church, which was called Basis, and they also had some people in the factories, and they produced also a paper, another magazine also in Porto called First May, which has also that perspective of helping people to organize themselves and giving them the word that they could speak for themselves. So all these things exist, but they were a minority, of course. But it's something that was mixed in all over but for instance, these tendencies were at that time more important than, for instance, I'm just taking a comparison, than the Trotskyites, who didn't almost exist in the Portuguese society at that time. But the Maoists were the main current, and they were very authoritarian. So it's.
So I hope you didn't get me wrong. So I didn't want to speak in favor of marriage.
No.
But so my question was, were there tendencies to build up
That's
away
okay.
from to keep up the libertarian flag. So it's a flag like red or the Chinese or whatever. So that's my point. So thanks a lot.
But I think the key word here is ambiguity, because you had 48 years of fascism and whatnot. So to have an underground organization, it's not easy to do it in a libertarian way, right? You have to be compartmentation, trust in the people who you hardly know. So it's very easy to develop authoritarian relationships. Even anarchist groups underground in Spain, for instance, which they kept, very anarcho-Bolsheviks. That's how most people who participated in it call it right now. And so that obviously created the space for these Maoist groups, very authoritarian, compartmented, discipline, Bolshevik discipline, that sort of imaginarium, to have a stronger role comparatively than in the rest of democratic Europe. So you had a lot of Maoists in France, but I mean, were they key elements of a labor struggle? Hardly ever. But in Portugal they were. And some libertarian topics were developed within or by these groups, just as like these leftist Catholics were against the church, although, right? But like MES, the movement of socialist left, which was very inspired in the Chilean MIR, and also in Lotta Continua in Italy, and the PSUP and PSU in France and whatnot, they were kind of libertarian but kind of Leninists. And so this ambiguity was, entangled in the movement. And so it's not always easy to solve these ambiguities after such a long period where there's censorship. Not every radical literature circulates. It's funny, though, that the Society of Spectacle was edited in 72 or 3 in Portugal, even before 25th of April. I think the censors looked at it and said, yeah, just let it through, nobody will read it. But there were some efforts, material efforts, not to escape to your question, just to precise, these campaigns in the north were not the Maoist groups or the Communist Party by itself. It was the military, formally, so the state, but under the influence of the Communist Party and the Maoists. And so some groups organized, and some workers' committees, and like the students of the medical school organized in order to provide medical care in poor neighborhoods. Some neighborhood committees organized to have them come. So these structures actually developed. What was always absent was an overall perspective how to develop this strategically to gain space from the state. There was always an ambiguous relationship with the state. And when the state clearly went one way and rebuilt itself, that ambiguity was solved against us. I think that's kind of how I would explain it mostly. But ambiguity is the word. And for a long time it lasted, and then it was solved in one direction.
Ich spreche jetzt absichtlich Deutsch, auch ich hoffe, es war niemand entmutigt, durch das englische Sprechen jetzt eben doch Fragen zu stellen und sich einzumischen. Ich glaube, das war niemand entmutigt, das auf Deutsch zu tun, denn das wäre ja auch möglich gewesen. Du machst es auch auf Deutsch. Und ich plädiere dafür, dass wir das
Perguntaram todos em inglês e ninguém perguntou em alemão. Acho que não.
Dass wir das jetzt einfach hier abrunden und ich möchte deswegen auch noch mal hinweisen, bevor ich uns von den Gästen verabschiede oder umgekehrt, dass wir die Möglichkeit nächste Woche haben, alle, die ernsthaft an der Weiterführung der Diskussion und diese Fragen viele Informationen, die hier nachgetragen werden mussten, interessiert sind. Wir können das in der Veranstaltung über die Landbesetzungen nächsten Donnerstag, die wir hier rund um diese Aufregung über die Besetzung von
Portugal vai mostrar o filme. Eu queria ver para ver. A minha colega diz que tem aspectos interessantes, nunca vi.
ansonsten,
Há um filme sobre esse problema.
das
Ah, ja.
habe ich jetzt noch was Wichtiges
Yeah.
vergessen, aber das heißt,
Um
wir
exercício
werden hier sehr
Thomas Edison supostamente
Schluss machen und die
manipulou
Diskussion so zahnlos fortsetzen, aber nicht als
No filme.
crítico sobre o
sonst
filme,
laufen einfach die Leute,
que é muito bom.
die haben jetzt
Ganhou muitos prémios agora.
Eu vejo na Netflix.
Chama-se Linha Vermelha.
Linha vermelha?
Red Line.
Listeneintrag und spendet.
O que quer dizer?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
A palavra que ela acaba de dizer, Eintrag, é a terceira pessoa do verbo isto